Good morning, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson. I'm a librarian with the Ramsey County Libraries, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on U.S.-Chinese relations, a Great Decisions event with Rick Olson. This is brought to you today through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota and the Ramsey County Libraries, Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Policy Association. We're thankful to all of these institutions for being able to make this event possible. Our speaker today is Rick Olson, and he is a retired professional with a variety of educational and life experiences. He has worked as an economist, an attorney, a certified financial planner, an agricultural loan officer, an agricultural cooperative president, a state representative in the state of Michigan, and a public school business manager.
Morning. Thank you, Kay. I will share my screen here.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. Okay, so size of China is about the same as the United States. However, the population is significantly different. If China was the largest country in the world by way of population, now it is actually second, with India has exceeded it with over 1.4 billion people. As you can see, China is quite a bit larger than the United States in terms of population. We've got 332 million, and they've got over 1.4. When you look at the gross domestic product, in other words, the total of all production and of services and goods that produce, United States is largest with 30 trillion. China is second with 19 trillion. Now, GDP is looked at in two different ways. One is called nominal, basically just adding dollars up. But if you start looking at purchasing power, it's a little bit different. So here's looking at what you call nominal. But if you're looking at purchasing power, when you're considering the value of what their dollar can buy versus what dollar of US can buy, they could be considered larger than us at this point from a production standpoint of goods and services. However, again, when you look at the difference on a per capita basis and on a per person basis, China lags way behind. So that's a big difference. You can look at how much power can a country exert. To some extent, you look at total, but sometimes you got to really look at individual. But China is really an economic powerhouse, the world's largest manufacturing hub, leading exporter of goods, and they're having rapid innovation in tech, green energy, and artificial intelligence. It's just a booming place. What they have really been attempting to increase their exports and influence in the world through what they call the investment in the Belt and Road Initiative. What they're doing is they are investing in infrastructure projects in over 60 countries, well over $1 trillion US investment so far. When I was in Tanzania, you could see a road being constructed, and whenever you go in many other countries, you'll see similar things going on. They haven't stopped at all. They started in 2013, and just last year, over $121 billion invested. So they are a major trade partner with us and the European Union and the Asian countries, as well as Africa. They are investing heavily in infrastructure, energy, and telecom. They have financed their growth a lot by debt, and they have just been investing in concrete things, and to providing employment for their people, as well as really for their own infrastructure. This is a picture of the Belt and Road Initiative. They got these plans for these roads and railroads and so forth that go all the way from China into the European Union. But they've also got the maritime version of that, and with building ports and so forth in many of these countries. It's somewhat controversial because in many cases, the countries that are left with these are actually on loans from China for these infrastructure projects, and then the host countries and responsible for paying back that debt, which in some cases they have a great deal of difficulty doing. They're very big now in innovation and technology. They've got some major tech giants, Huawei, Tencent, Alibaba, BYD. They're leader in 5G telecommunications, electric vehicles, and fintech, financial technology. Very high level of patent filings and research and development investment. Familiar trademarks you may see, the Huawei, BYD, and Alibaba. So like I say, they've increased their R&D spending a lot, and they're closing the gap with the United States, which we've been the leader, but they're closing the gap. They are, when you rank them in terms of index and how much they're improving, they've improved by 8 indicators. Well, 5 have worsened by this by 2024 Global Innovation Tracker, but they're coming. Their adoption of mobile phones and their technology has been massive. Just a major transformation of the country. When you look at it, these blue graph indicators are the mobile installations. You look at 1.2 billion basically of the mobile phones in China. And meanwhile, the fixed lines have been dropping. So major use of mobile phones. When I was there, when was that? 2017. There were just phones everywhere, and what I was amazed at was every place that you buy something, including the little shops, you would pay with your phone. We're way ahead of the United States in terms of use of phones that way. When you look at total data transfer, major growth as well. We look at the total investment in this industry, huge as well. They are graduating science and engineering students at a very rapid rate, way more than we are. So that's a concern when it comes to technology and innovation. They are really going whole hog when it comes to artificial intelligence integration, and they're really competing with us very much. We thought we were way ahead in AI until they came out with that. I forget the name of the app that says is almost as fast as the U.S. stuff, and for much cheaper. That kind of put the AI industry kind of on notice here this spring. They are producing electric vehicles like crazy. They sold over 8.1 million electric cars in 2023 and over 11 million in 24. So not only are they producing a lot, they are accelerating. And in fact, they are very competitive cost-wise, very low cost compared to others. And they're competing in the European Union. Right now, they're forbidden to come into the United States, but they are going to be a major competitor worldwide. They're trying to estimate it to be around 8% of the U.S.'s science and technology capability. So not caught up with us yet, but huge. One of the big excuses of why we should not fight climate change in the past has been, well, why would we do it if China doesn't? If China doesn't do it, then it's wasted. Well, they have been actually a leader when it comes to environmental. They're the largest investor in renewable energy, the world's biggest producer of solar panels and electric vehicles. In fact, that's one of the major issues among the world. They're producing more than they can actually use themselves and dumping them on the world markets. And they're active in the climate change agreements like the Paris Accord, which the United States no longer is part of. China is the world's largest installer of solar plants and wind farms. Like I say, they produce these panels and turbines and they sell them very cheaply in other countries. And that's what made our government uneasy, and the reason we have put tariffs on many things from China. So it's a success, but it's also created a challenge. Now, they are also a geopolitical influence, being a permanent UN member of the UN Security Council. And they have strong ties in Russia, Africa, Latin America. They're making great efforts to be, a competitor all over the world. And that's been a real challenge for us. Supposedly, U.S. has more soft power in that we are more liked and more trusted. But recent events has put that soft power in question. They're active in various regional bodies like the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement in Eurasian countries. Also BRICS, which is a group of countries, including the big ones, Brazil, China, Egypt, India, which is, this is BRICS was named for. So they're trying to create a new network of influence within the world. Okay, so China is big and rising. So why are we concerned about it? Well, they're creating economic competition and trade imbalances. Say they're growing economic power. They are just, like I say, the largest or second largest economic power in the world, where we have been dominant for years. They've got huge trade deficits with the United States, or we have trade deficit with them. We import way more from China than they get from us. And that has raised concerns about job losses here in the United States and the hollowing out of American industries. It's said that we are exporting our jobs to China. But China, there is some legitimate complaints. There have been a number of unfair trade practices that China has done. When a company goes to set up a plant in China, they are, in most cases, forced to give their technology to China, which obviously we're giving away our technological advantage in that way. They've been accused of manipulating their currency. That's may or may not be true, but they certainly have been involved in stealing intellectual property. I listened to one course by the Great Courses series, and the teacher of that course, an expert in this field, indicated he believes that every major Fortune 500 company in the United States has been hacked by China and the intellectual property stolen. Have you also used forced labor, which is obviously cheap, with the Rohingya in Western China. Now, we've had a big trade deficit with China for some time. We import almost $4 billion worth of goods, and we export to them 110 billion. So, about $300 billion difference in what we trade with China. And that's been growing. And so, we just, our trade balances have not been good. Meanwhile, we do have what's called a current account balance, in that they buy US bonds and so forth. So we are sending our money to them, and they're sending their goods to us. So why is there this great imbalance in trade? Well, first of all, they are an export-oriented economy. They just have massive manufacturing capacity, a large volume of goods. Meanwhile, the United States has strong consumer demand. We like getting things good, cheap. For a while, you may remember way back, China and Japan, goods for that matter, had a bad reputation for low quality, but now their quality is quite good, and in fact, in some cases, better. So U.S. consumers like that. Like I said, some people argue they manipulated the currency, which would make their goods cheaper for us. In some cases, they have restricted access for us to send things to them. And lastly on this, China, sometimes people claim that China has an advantage because China is so much state run, they can invest directly into an industry that they want to expand, whether it be AI, whether it be vehicles, whether it be solar panels, other kinds of technology that they deem as being strategic, that they can invest directly in that. And that's not something we've done a large amount of. That was part of Biden's plan in the Infrastructure Act. However, some of that may be unwound here shortly. So some people say, well, how about if we can't send goods there, how about U.S. services? Well, because we do have actually a surplus in what we sell in services as compared to services we import. But unfortunately, when it comes to China, they don't import a whole lot of services from us. So it reduces a little bit the deficit, but it's not a great deal of help. Okay, on that topic, obviously the trade deficit has been an issue, and tariffs have been imposed by President Trump. But there was an agreement on June 9th and 10th for what they call a framework agreement, not the total detailed agreement, that would lower the reciprocal tariff rates back to 10%. The major reduction from where President Trump indicated 145% for China. However, the details of this is yet to be negotiated. So where this will end up, well, we don't really know. Meanwhile, the effective tariff rate on most Chinese goods can be as high as 55%. First of all, there's this 10% minimum baseline tariff. There was a previous 20% fentanyl tariff imposed in March, and then there's 25% tariff on some other goods. So where this ends up, we just stay tuned because this is still much being negotiated. It's by no means a done deal. One of the big trump cards, you could say, China has in this discussion is that they are the major producer of rare earth mining, rare earth minerals. Green is China. You know, there are other large producers. You know, other countries, 30%, and U.S. 38. I could say metric tons, I should say, 38,000. But China is the big dog, and these are needed in so many of the energy production, any of the technology production products, and so forth. Experts fear that much of our economy can grind to a halt without these rare earth minerals. And currently, we are exporting over 80% of these rare earth minerals. So that is a real constraint in the United States' power to negotiate a really, really favorable agreement. Another thing to keep in mind is that the United States has a tremendous, tremendous national debt. And Japan and China hold a significant amount of that national debt, the U.S. bonds and so forth. They're the two largest. China is the second, and so is there some fear of, could China dump the U.S. bonds on the market, drive down the value of the U.S. dollar, and so forth? That we don't know whether that's how feasible that is, because that might also hurt them. So, another reason we're concerned about China is their military modernization and their regional influence. They have been increasing and modernizing their military very rapidly and with very advanced weapon systems. They are claiming areas in the South China Sea. They have made islands and put armaments on the islands in areas that they claim that conflict with other Southeast Asian nations as far as who owns those areas. And that has caused a great deal of concern because those waters between all these countries, there's a tremendous amount of trade and shipping going through there. And so that's not only a concern for military, but also just for control of the shipping lanes. And also, the big area that we're concerned about is what do they do for Taiwan? What is, they operate on the idea that they are one country and Taiwan is still part of China. People in Taiwan think differently. And so the question is, will China invade Taiwan or not? And so that's, we don't know. Is this simply threat, or is there opportunities for China to take over Taiwan without invading? So the United States policy has been what's called strategic ambiguity. Still saying China's, it's part of China, but leaving it ambiguous whether we would defend Taiwan should China invade. When you look at their military, they've got over 2 billion people in the active military and about another 500,000 on reserve. We're 1,390,000 by this estimate, quite a bit behind in terms of numbers. But China has really emerged as a great maritime power. The United States has really had control of the seas for years. And their idea is that by 2035, they will be equal to the United States. As of last August, they boasted 370 what they call platforms, ships out there that can exert power. So from 370, they're expected to go to 395 ships next year and 435 by 2030. So this is a major expansion. Also very, very up-to-date ships. Compare these numbers. U.S. Navy has 296 battle force ships, and they're actually declining a little bit. So, and the United Kingdom's Royal Navy is just 45 ships. So this is a significantly larger naval force than we have. But they're also increasing the quality and in addition to the quantity, because they've got a strategic missile arsenal. And they're expected to have 1,000 nuclear warheads, which could strike the United States. While this is less than U.S. and Russia, how many times over do you have to wipe out something before it's done? You only have to do it once. They are also really weaponizing space. And they lead in defense-related satellite launches. And they launched last December a remote sensing satellite capable of identifying and tracking car-sized objects in the Indo-Pacific. And that really threatens the United States and our assets in that area. So that's a great deal of concern of how much they're doing that. Do they have a satellite killer? That's what's also of concern. But also of concern is that, and this is a weird word, but intelligentized warfare. They want to be using AI and autonomous systems in their battle plans and so forth. They really want to be a leader in that area. They are watching very, very closely what Ukraine is doing against Russia in using drone swarms and so forth to just overpower defensive systems. Something of great concern to our military leaders. So I mentioned, they challenge take over possibly Taiwan, but why do we care? Well, number one, they're an economic importance, being the major semiconductor manufacturer. They just dominate the production of cutting-edge microchips, and that's vital for electronics, automobiles, and advanced technologies. They are also very, very important in the supply chain of some other products. So that could actually cripple global manufacturing and supply chains because of the importance of these semiconductors. Also important is where China and Taiwan are located, and in between them is the Taiwan Strait, it's a key shipping lane, which handles trillions of dollars of trade annually. So when you look at semiconductors, you can see Taiwan is way, way ahead of everybody else in terms of production of those high-end chips. So, there's two Taiwanese companies that are in the top three. Here's more. So very, very important in that. And here's the Taiwan Strait where a lot of trade goes through. So very critical for just the domestic trade, but also militarily. Now, they're also important from a strategic important reason. They are part of, Taiwan is part of the first island chain. And there's two chains of islands in that area. And Taiwan's in the first chain. That's really important for containing China's military expansion. It's also seen as protecting China as maintaining our credibility and influence in the area because it's been perceived that we would protect Taiwan. Now, is that is somewhat in question? Maybe. If U.S. Well, let's put it this way: China is watching very closely what we do with Ukraine. If we back off in supporting Ukraine, would we do the same for Taiwan? Also, Taiwan is a successful democracy, and we have really been wanting to support democracies against autocracies like China, Russia, Iran, and so forth. And so that's that struggle between democracy and authoritative systems. Another concern generally about China is the lack of democracy, like I mentioned, because it's controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And that's just a big contrast to our democratic values. Also, China has been accused of human rights abuses. I think this is not only accused, but pretty well proven, particularly with their repression of ethnic minorities, political dissidents, and journalists. What they're doing into the Rohingya in the western part of China, it's basically labor camps for a lot of Muslim people. We're also concerned about cyber espionage and influence. Like I mentioned, a lot of hacking by China of the United States companies. And also they're just concerned about espionage and their attempt to influence our politics and institutions. A couple of examples with the Huawei, which they produce network routers and switches and so forth. This is applied by China, and involves the potential of espionage, sabotage, disruption, and data theft, because companies like them are obligated to cooperate with the Chinese intelligence efforts. These are, quote, private companies, but they sort of bend the knee to the Chinese military and intelligence. So concerned about product. Also with the TikTok issue, we're worried about the collection of individuals' information, which could potentially be weaponized. Now that the Congress has said that must be sold. China cannot be involved in ownership of that. But the law has been extended. The deadline for that has been extended several times now, 3 times just this year alone. So just stay tuned to that issue. Okay, we're concerned about China because it's just a plain geopolitical competition. Exactly what all they're doing in the rest of the Southeast Asia, what they're doing in Africa. It really affects our ability to compete with our technology, economics, and our military power. They are really attempting to be a power globally, not just in Southeast Asia. And this is putting some really pressure on the liberal international order and the rules that we've been operating under with trade and so forth for a long, long time. And obviously, there's ideological differences because other countries we're looking at is the U.S. economic model the best for them, or should they have more of a state-led program where the government decides what industries be done? Um, in this ideological struggle, what's a particular concern recently is there's getting more and more closer alignment between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Although interestingly enough, just this morning I read an article about Russia hacking Russia and trying to really learn what they are doing militarily and how they're trying to learn as much as they can from Russia. So maybe friends, but maybe not as close friends as we all think. Other concerns with China is environmental issues. They have very, very high carbon emissions. And that has long been a concern with us. But as I mentioned before, they are now a leader in that area. They still are emitting, high amounts, but they are working very, very hard at it. Also, the COVID really put China on the map in terms of a public health issue because the world is so connected with trade and people moving so much. There got to be great questions about China's transparency because with the initial outbreak, they did not share information to us as quickly as would have been good to respond as the very best we could have. So how many deaths were caused because of that lack of transparency? Hard to say, but it's obviously a challenge. Now, based on all that, where are the potential consequences of conflict? Well, we could have great economic disruption globally. Really could disrupt their supply chains, trade, and financial markets. A war in the Taiwan Strait could really destabilize the whole region, could draw in other countries. And obviously, war creates its own humanitarian crises. Would really result in a significant loss of life and displacement of people. So the potential implications of this is there's really in process a shifting global power balance. It was the bipolar power balance between Russia, or Soviet Union, and the United States. Then when Soviet Union dissolved, we were sort of a unipolar, just us, we were the big dogs. China rises, they're going to be exerting more and more influence globally. It's going to be a challenge, not only economically, but militarily. There's going to be increased regional tension. So the U.S. has capitalized on this and trying to increase better relationships with some of those Asian countries, and with Australia, and Japan. There's some alliances, loose alliances with those countries, and as well as India. We see India as being maybe a counterbalance to China in the area. So we'll see, but it's a challenge, lots of tension. So there is a great potential for conflict. This is something we're very concerned about militarily. But then that makes an impact on U.S. military spending. Military already, we spend already, $1 trillion, whatever, on military each year. And do we need to spend more? As China increases their military power, do we need to do the same? Big question in the U.S. Capitol. However, many people say our fear of China is somewhat overblown, and we will, remains to see whether that criticism is true or not. But they do have significant weaknesses. Their economic growth is slowing, and that's really important for them, particularly as they try to create jobs for the young folks. And unless they keep growing and creating jobs, that's going to create domestic instability in China. The big problem mentioned here, and we'll come back to it again, is the lack of private consumption. The domestic consumption of goods in China is very low. Uh, One of the ways that they have really kept their economy going is just building, 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 building. In fact, they have built entire new cities. And there are some of those new cities that are ghost towns, that there's nobody living in them. Um, and they have built so much at times that there's just overproduction. There's people haven't needed them, and then obviously empty places cause bankruptcies of the companies that build them, create real economic problems. And so what happens is the prices of some of those things have been dropping, and deflation is something very, very dangerous for economies. So they're very concerned about that. They do also have very high youth unemployment, uh, and that's really a growing concern not only of itself, but it's also causing consumer confidence to decline. And consumer confidence has an impact then on how much people want to save. Um, Meanwhile, China has been accumulating a tremendous amount of debt. The United States have a huge national debt at this point. Um, so does the national government of China, but local governments as well has been having a lot of debt. One of the ways that the local governments had financed the growth and so forth in the area had been just seizing land, selling off that land, which obviously is revenue, to finance projects. Well, if real estate projects are slowing down, that's not that's not as available anymore. So will the local governments be able to pay their debts? China, basically, the real weakness is it's China's dependence on exports. They've got a large domestic market, which U.S. companies want to get to, but China itself is heavily reliant on exports, which makes it vulnerable to what happens to the global economy. China also has some limited ability to do things monetarily, like just issuing bonds and so forth because of its national debt. And with interest rates rising now during the pandemic and recent years, we're very used to very, very low interest rates. But with global interest rates rising now, that makes it more difficult to sell bonds and then be able to repay them. Now, China's national debt now equals 100% of its GDP, gross domestic product, and frankly, it's a lower level of the United States. But it's really big compared to other countries with incomes per capita similar to China. So, like I said, just the Chinese national debt is big. By the time you add the local government borrowing, it's really huge. That is a major problem. Other problems they have, their population is aging. The one-child policy had significant impacts in slowing down the number of births. And now young folks don't seem to be all that interested in having large families. So that's causing problems in terms of the potential future workforce, as well as how do you financially support an aging population? We've got an issue here in the United States. To some extent, we have partially solved that by immigration into our country, but they don't have a whole lot of immigration into China. And so they're going to have some not only current but growing problems on how do they support their aging population. Their political system just really, does not actually solve these problems easily. They're difficult to have political reforms, very lack of transparency and accountability of the Chinese Communist Party really makes it difficult for, and also there's corruption in the country the big oligarchs and so forth, the big companies, and people who are well positioned, corruption. And this is really causing some localized unrest, more than previously. Obviously, as I mentioned before, there's human rights concerns with China's with the Rohingyas and so forth. But there are just even generally in the population, freedom of expression, no religious freedom, and the treatment of ethnic minorities. When I was in China in 2017, I could tell that my internet use was being tracked. They're just tracking, and with all the cameras and so forth, they've got a database of most people in the country, which is mind-boggling when you consider how many people there are. They also have environmental issues, not only climate change, but huge pollution problems and resource depletion. That's really a problem for them, particularly air pollution. You may remember the Beijing Olympics. They shut factories down and everything, tried to show the world, clean air, that they had clean air, but usually pollution, air pollution in particular, there is pretty bad. Also, some of the pollution or the metals and so forth in some of the agricultural lands, it can be bad. And there is actually weak oversight of local governments by the central government. So, that ends up being inefficient use of resources by bad projects, bad planning, and just uneven development. But if we get right back down to it, their dependence on foreign trade is the major weakness. And they are not innovating, although they're innovating quite quickly. What pundits indicate is that they have difficulty with creating or fostering creativity. I mean, they can copy people very well quickly, but doing the fundamental background research leads to new products and services. Critics say that they are not that good at that, but certainly big enough and powerful enough to be a concern. Their big challenge is, how do you increase domestic consumption? And what the deal is they save a tremendously high percent of what people earn. When you look at this, it's almost what 48, 45%, 46% of everything that people earn. This is 2017, and it's not improved. That they save that. Why would you do that? Well, here in the United States, we've got safety nets for people who are getting older, Social Security. And people have been able to save in our IRAs and so forth. But those safety nets are not as robust in China as here. And so what do you do? Like in many countries, your Social Security is having a lot of kids. Well, they're one-child policy. Well, they can't have a lot of kids to support you when you get old. So, boy, you better save yourself so you've got money when you grow older. So they do that, they don't know what tomorrow may bring, and so they've got to save. So China has involved some projects in which people can trade in an old appliance and get a new one at a very advantageous rate. They really tried to increase domestic consumption, but that's so far had limited impact. So before I go to these questions, one of the pundits or sources that I've researched is suggest that China's huge size, it gives it a great advantage because it is large. And when you say, why did the United States really outpace Britain in the 1800s? We were larger. We had a bigger market. We could have better economies of scale. Why is the United States still leader versus the European Union, which is also huge? Again, we're larger. So they're saying just the large size of China is really, really critical. And they are thinking that that's going to give them an advantage into the future and overlap the United States in the economy and so forth. Better trader with other partners, and their prescription is that we need to have tighter uh, relationships with our allies so that we collectively have a bigger area. So we're not reliant on just the U.S. Domestic market, but we have the whole U.S., Europe, and maybe Australia and some other of our allies as a counterbalance to China's huge size. Who knows? That's one way to look at it. And meanwhile, the Trump administration has been trying to challenge it on terms of trade issues, primarily by use of tariffs. So a couple of questions that really come up that are huge is, excuse me, should the U.S. continue its strategic ambiguity with regard to China? Or should we either commit to support China or conversely tell China you're on your own? I don't know, big question. If we give up the idea of strategic ambiguity one way or the other, if we say Taiwan, you're on your own, that would obviously encourage China to take over Taiwan much more aggressively. If we commit to China to Taiwan, that's really crossing a red line with China, and who knows how they may react. Very important question. At one point recently, I don't remember sure whether it was Biden said something that we would support them, support Taiwan, but that was backed off pretty quickly. So hold on a second. Hi, it's Rick. Yeah, hold on a second. I can't take the call right now. Excuse me. I thought that might have been something relating to this. Okay. Anyway, another question is, we have really supported our companies going to China because of the economic opportunities there. I try to get into the domestic market in China, and so that's a big issue when it comes to do we favor increased economic ties, or do we prioritize the military challenges? Do we have a tough approach or a more conciliatory approach? It's big question. Which way do we go with that? So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and we'll see if we have questions or comments of the audience.
Okay, we do have a few.
Yeah.
More will be coming in here. You were talking previously about patents that China has, and someone is asking, how does one acquire a patent that is recognized internationally?
That I don't know. The difficulty is with China, they don't necessarily honor patents. So it may be worth the paper it's written on when it comes to China. because they have stolen so many of the trade secrets. That I don't. When it comes to China, I wouldn't consider it to be very valuable.
Okay. How important is a large navy in this age of drones and missiles?
A good question, and that can be raised by the ability of Ukraine to, with drones, to take out some of the Russian ships in the Black Sea. And so to some extent, some people consider, our big aircraft carriers as being just easy targets, floating targets when it comes to missiles and so forth, particularly with the hypersonic missiles that are much more difficult to intercept. Um, and with these drone swarms, can you just overwhelm the ability of the defensive system to pick up and destroy them as they come? So big question of that. But
Proximity?
pardon?
As I'd say proximity, you have to be able to,
Yeah,
your drones have to come from somewhere.
yeah. With naval, you can't exactly put a bunch of drones in a truck like Ukraine did for Russian. But yeah, so it's a greater concern that the drone technology is really changing the whole military concept of war, and that's one reason why China has really been hacking into the Russian efforts in Ukraine. They're trying to pick up what can we learn about how, China's not been in war itself, so can you learn from other people's experience? And obviously, Russia is one they might be able to learn from, as well as while they're watching what Ukraine is doing.
Okay. One was commenting on how when you listed the number of naval ships for China and the US, you seem to indicate that these ships are equivalent in power. They're saying it's false. Of course, the US has the only country with aircraft supercarriers. China has a couple of small ones. Um, China's not able to project sea power beyond the South Sea, they're saying. But I'd say it's because China is probably currently ranked second navally.
Yeah, they're not quite up to us yet,
Right.
both in quantity or quality, but they are really increasing their numbers greatly. They are increasing their quality greatly because they really do want to extend their power beyond Southeast Asia seas, and so they're increasing in their capability of doing that. So it's a challenge. Our, if I had to bet one against the other, I'd bet on the U.S. in a war on that, but I wouldn't want to test it.
Yeah. Okay. Um, there's a scenario where China's industrial policy ends up backfiring. Subsidies and cheap bank loans dished out to high quality and low quality companies alike could flood the market with undesired product, spurring vicious cutthroat price wars, which destroy profit margins, exacerbate deflation, generally making the macroeconomic situation worse. And then China's government could double down by trying to protect employment by never halting subsidies for companies that fail. Seems more of a statement, but do
Yeah,
you
but
think that
there's,
that's
it's very, very similar. The question of is it an advantage for China to be dumping these products at below costs and just trying to get market share at the expense of they're just losing money. It's a very similar question domestically in antitrust policy. There's a big question of can a U.S. company do that? That would be a violation of the antitrust policy of the United States. Way back in law school, my professor was very much a free market person, and his belief was we should let people do that because as soon as the company that goes bankrupt for doing that, people can fill in the gap because the technology is there. That is something we shouldn't be concerned about. I don't know. Does his reasoning apply internationally? Well, in the short run, obviously, we have a great deal of domestic resistance to that if that kills jobs here in the United States. Obviously, we don't want the uh, short run impacts, even if the long term impacts may be more benign. So we don't want that happening. European Union countries don't want that happening. And so that's really an issue. That's one reason why the BYD electric vehicles aren't even allowed here in the United States, because they are, from what I read, that they are technologically equivalent or equal to the Teslas, and they're doing them very, very cheap. And that's a if they can outcompete Tesla, they're probably going to outcompete most of the other U.S. EV production producers in the country. So big concern about dumping. Like I said, the long-term impact, may be bad for those people who do it, bankruptcy and so forth. And to the extent that the Chinese government subsidizes losing firms and so forth, or losing local governments, inefficiency is never good for an economy. So those are weaknesses of China. How bad they will damage China in the long term remains to be seen.
Okay. I know we talked about the one-child policy for a while, and that was in place from 79 to 2015. And then they eased things up to a two-child policy in 2016, and it's currently at a three-child policy as of 2021. But in terms of the impact of having more births with this aging population, that's going to have an impact in terms of people to work in these, I would think, factories, and how cheap will things be when they don't have the population to support?
Yeah. Well, yes, China has changed their policy, but from what I've read, there has not been a significant impact in fertility. As people raise in their income, uh, just worldwide, people begin to have fewer and fewer kids. The fertility rate has dropped everywhere except in Africa, pretty much everywhere except Africa, and that's a problem. Japan, it's been a problem for a long time. China is now a major problem. Here in the United States, the problem that the only reason that we're continuing to grow is through immigration. So that, but as income has risen in China, the fertility rate just has not responded like the Chinese government probably hoped it would by relaxing the one-child policy.
Someone's commenting that most of what China is producing is not being exported in terms of such as cars, for example. Is that not being exported to the US or not being exported, Chinese cars beyond China?
They are making a big push into the European Union,
Okay.
and there's other countries of the world. Not the United States, no, but other some other parts of the world. When it comes to solar panels, they have exported tons and tons and tons of solar panels all over the place. They had been exporting steel a lot of different places. So some of the major things they have exported, a large amount of that are considered to be really strategic type of production products, for many countries. Primarily because they have been some of these have been major employers in each of our countries. Cars, for example, steel, for example, these are considered to be really critical industries that we retain. And that's why we've wanted to protect them to whatever we can. So,
Okay, I was looking a little bit at the Hong Kong
yeah.
turnover and kind of comparing that to Taiwan a little bit. And um, there's a difference in terms of Hong Kong has never been recognized as a true democracy because they haven't had elections. They were a colony under Britain, so therefore it's a little different than Taiwan, which does hold democratic
Yeah.
elections, but it's still Hong Kong how it's been treated by China because it had rights supposedly for 50 years that were going to be transitioning, and about halfway in with China coming in and clamping down on what those rights are. Um,
Yeah.
it kind of indicates what might happen with Taiwan.
Yeah. China, or Taiwan has, has really been looking at Hong Kong, where Hong Kong had been, basically a capitalist country and really booming and whatnot. So Taiwan is looking as China took that over, how Hong Kong's been treated, and really they're asking themselves, do we want to be treated the same way? And they don't. And so it's a definite warning to Taiwan of what could happen to them if
Mhm.
China does take over. So I know the freedoms in Hong Kong have been significantly restricted. So yeah, if I was Taiwan, I'd be looking at Hong Kong pretty closely and saying, I don't want that.
So, yeah, it just like even today reported 7 hours ago that China sends scores of planes across Central Line in the Taiwan Strait because a UK ship patrol was detected near the island. And it's
Yeah,
interesting to see how they're starting to flex militarily with
yeah.
Taiwan.
And
So,
what you mentioned is that there's sort of a line by agreement that each uh, military doesn't go across whatever.
mhm.
But China has been increasingly challenging that and sending planes over. And also, what they've done in many places is use quote, fishing vessels to go and do things, and obviously for military reasons. And so, but one of the obviously the biggest violation was the creation of islands that never existed before, and then put military bases on them. So uh, many of these countries there have conflicting ownership claims. You know, there's a 10 mile limit within each country that they're supposed to have exclusive area, and then you got a 200-mile range you have some influence over. And so all these are close enough together that they overlap. And so how do you deal with those overlaps?
Okay, so what are countries in the region, such as Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, who could approach China's increasing dominance? Is there any?
I don't know that there's any that are in as good position as India in some ways because of its huge size. But practically speaking, I don't know that there's any one country that can blunt China's efforts alone. Not even the United States. Um, the idea of America first as being America alone probably will not work in the Pacific. And that's why it's really important to have increased alliances like with uh, with Australia and Japan, the Southeast Asian countries, and so forth. Those alliances collectively, could be effective, but we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that agreement that had been negotiated by what was that way back to Obama? Was that? I forget. Yeah, I think it was Obama where Trump pulled out of that for the first, or Trump pulled out of that in the first term, and now that alliance has been somewhat tightened up with China included in that. Is there a way to somehow get in there as well in some way to our advantage? I don't know. But obviously that was an opportunity lost or thrown away. But we need to really continue to work on alliances because together we have more power than alone.
So, looking at the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization from 54, um, do you know uh, how familiar are you with speaking on that at all?
I don't know too much about it other than I know that it exists, and I know that was an effort to tie these countries together in not only an economic alliance but more of a military alliance of self-protection. It's not as strong as NATO, though it doesn't have the attack on one is considered attack on all.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that tight as NATO's. Even on paper, much less in practicality.
So, okay. And let's see. In terms of that video that you were talking about previously,
Yeah,
how long was that?
it's a 29-minute video, and people can see it for $5. Sorry, I really apologize for that glitch. I thought we had it all taken care of. Unfortunately, when I worked it by myself, it didn't work together. But if you would go to look at Master Class Great Decisions and Google that, you will pull that up. And you could watch all of the videos in the Great Decisions program for a total of $40 or simply $5 each. Um, they are they are good, and they come at it with a little different perspective. We covered most of the issues. I don't know that we've lost anything, but it would have been useful for you to have seen it, just someone else's perspective on these issues.
Okay, so they could also get to that probably through the what I say, Global Minnesota website possibly,
Yeah,
and
and my understanding is there are some libraries that you can get to them free as well. Uh,
okay. I don't
um,
know if we have that for the here at the Ramsey County Libraries. We have the handbooks
yeah,
that have articles. I'd say Hennepin County might be one. Can check. I haven't checked that myself, but it's
I haven't reached it through a library myself, but I've been told that some libraries do.
so yeah, so there's always places to look for these things. Anyone else have questions? We still have time. We've got about 15 minutes that we could discuss anything further. Where is it gonna go? Just looking at the Southeast. I'm pulling up a bunch of different things here. So looking at Taiwan, also, I would say you can tell where places are at based on their media in terms of what they're producing media-wise, such as movies and TV shows. And I just think about that because I watch a lot of Asian
Yeah.
media.
Well, one of the things that China has, I've read that recently is attempting to do is to restrict the availability of U.S. movies
Mhm.
in China. And movies internationally is a major export of the United States. And so they don't want U.S. movies shown in the United States because of
Right.
what people may learn culturally about the United States, which may conflict with the Chinese way.
Mhm.
Um, and so they've also tried to make impacts in movies produced in the United States by having Chinese stuff in them. So they try to protect, and they're also trying to project into other areas as far as movies are concerned. Um, so um, it's it's the big question is how serious, is China really to our way of life? Are all our concerns really valid? Does the United States need to be dominant for us to have good standards of living? You can get into big arguments about that. How dominant do we need to be? Is it great to be number one? But you could look at some of the living standards in some of the European countries that are very good. They're not number one. They're not number two. They're not number 10. How important is dominance? To us long term. Well, to the extent that it affects our economies and our ability to produce, and then maybe it is important. How important do we consider the integrity of a country's borders? Well, that issue is at stake in Ukraine. Does that in fact apply to Taiwan when China says it's been China all along? Is that invasion, or does that violate the integrity of a country's borders? They would argue no. But after however many years Taiwan has operated on its own, one could argue it's pretty hard to argue they're not a country. So that's one reason why China is watching what happens in Ukraine so carefully, is if we just say, well, Ukraine's on its own, and the European countries say, well, other countries say, well, yep, good luck there. That's pretty much a green light given China for taking over Taiwan. At least that's the argument. So
I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
Someone's wondering, can you talk a little more about the concerns and potential solutions around the ability of China to deploy space-based satellite killing capabilities? Does the US also have that capability?
I don't know. That is a lot of the problems for us as average or normal citizens. There's so much we don't know. And I know that there are fears that China can do it. I've read that there are fears that they can do it. Whether we already have that capability or not, I don't know. But one of the things that I do know that both countries have, Russia has, much of our communications are vulnerable to electromagnetic charges, which can be set off in space by nuclear bombs. We could disrupt our GPS. We could disrupt our telecommunications. Those are very, very vulnerable, and it's only international cooperation that keeps that going. GPS is really, really important when it comes not only to finding my way to a grocery store, but it's important for military to know what they're doing. Interestingly enough, Ukraine has developed a technology for its drones that they don't have to rely on GPS. Just basically from the mapping technologies and stuff, they can find their way without GPS. Do we have that capability? I'm sure we're trying to get that from Ukraine as fast as we can. So satellites, we rely on satellites so much, and whether they can kill them or we can kill them, we don't know. As citizens, we don't know.
No. Well, I know we were talking about AI earlier, and the name of the one that you were wondering about is DeepSeek.
Oh yeah, DeepSeek.
That's the large
Yep.
language model
Yep.
that can compete with Chat GPT somewhat.
Yeah, and when they announced, obviously that was a great concern. If you can do this for far less cost, obviously that's a big wow. What's unknown is really how much support they really had from China that's not disclosed.
Right.
Other thing is to what extent did they just cannibalize or existing models and so forth? Was it really built up from scratch like the other ones have had to do? So, but anyway, it put a shock into the AI industry.
Yes, and another one that's up and coming from China is Manis, MANIS, they're calling it, an artificial intelligence agent that can take actions and complete tasks autonomously. So
Ah,
that's one to be looking out for in news reports if they are talking about that. Um, in fact, our class 2 weeks ago was on AI and American security. And someone's asking, where can I see that through Ollie? How can I access that class? That is currently up on the Ollie YouTube channel. You can access it by typing in Great Decisions, AI, and US security. It's also on the Ramsey County Library website under top of the banner under classes and events. Click on that, and there's at the bottom of the drop-down menu, there are event program videos that you can click on and see the past ones. This will be up on there when that is posted on the Ollie YouTube channel. So, um, okay, anything else? Still time to discuss, people. So, um, anything you want to say, Rick?
no, other than apologize again for the technological glitch. But hopefully this has been useful to people, to listeners and watchers.
Mhm.
China obviously is going to be on our radar for a long time.
Right. It's one of those things to note, like you were talking about how they're not trying not to import US movies. I know in mainland China, a lot of anything before it can be aired has to get the approval of the government. They might censor things before it's shown, like that. Whereas Taiwan and Hong Kong have had so much freedom, and we see that in terms of like Hong Kong cinema was a huge, impact in terms of on for cinema here. And I just know I compare because I watch from all three places to see, and you can tell some of their shows are like surrounding drone technology. It'll be a whole show where it's looking at the relationship between people, and it's like, look at all the great things that we're doing. And this is a fiction-based show, but they're like, look at all of the great things we're doing with Chinese drone technology. And this is then played throughout all of China, um, promoting that.
Yeah, movies have been a propaganda mechanism for quite some time, including one of
Yeah.
my very uh, long favorites when I was a kid. Um, I forget the name of it now. But basically, the fight between the Russian army and with the White Russians and so forth. It was um, Dr. Zhivago. Yeah, that was a U.S. propaganda movie that I didn't know. Um, so we've used movies for propaganda. Obviously, China is now doing the same. So
No. Okay, well, um, we're 6 minutes out from when we normally end, but if no one has any more questions or comments, and then we just might wrap up early for the day, and everyone can have a great time. Anything else you want to say in closing, Rick? Or
yeah, stay cool. It's going to be warm.
okay, well, thanks everyone, and we will see you again in the fall when we start in October again. So be looking for sign up sometime coming this fall, probably August and September. Things will start opening up for that. But otherwise, everyone, have a great summer. Stay cool this weekend, and we'll see you on the other side.
Bye-bye.
Bye.